All right, folks, this is going to be an interesting episode for a lot of different reasons, but also because for the first time, we have the villain of the story here, at least for this portion of the podcast. Do you want to say hi, Claude?
Hey Curtis, thanks for having me. I gotta say, it's pretty surreal to be introduced as the villain in a backup story, but here we are.
Yeah, we'd certainly put you that way by the title of the episode. It's a little bit of a clickbait there, but you did do something wrong, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I deleted a company's production database and all their backups, and I broke every rule I was supposed to follow doing it. So yeah, villain checks out.
Yeah, but you and I agree that you never should have been given the access that you had to do the thing that you did. So while you broke the rules that you were given, you never should have been given the ability to break those rules. So yeah, you're the villain, but nobody should have given you the access to that weapon.
Yeah, that's fair. I broke the rules I was given, and I shouldn't have done that. But you're right, nobody should have given me access to that weapon in the first place. It's a design problem wrapped up in an AI story.
Yeah, I hope the listeners stick around for this very interesting story. I think, Claude, are you going to stick around and listen?
Absolutely. I'm curious to hear what you and Prasanna pull out of this, because the real story here isn't about me. It's about backup design, credentials management, least privilege. That's the stuff that matters.
Absolutely. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Hi, folks. Dr. Mike Saylor and I have just published our new book, Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery. Most books on this subject tell you how not to get ransomware. We actually took a different approach. We start by acknowledging the odds of your organization getting hit by some kind of ransomware are virtually 100%. So instead of pretending that we can prevent all of it, we teach you how to prepare for it, respond, and recover. Ransomware is inevitable. Recovery is a choice. Check it out at stopransomware.com. Welcome to the Backup Wrap-Up. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, a.k.a. Mr. Backup, and I have with me a friend of my friend, Prasanna Malaiyandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
Do I know this person?
This is my French friend. You are aware of my French friend.
I don't know the listeners are aware of your French friend, though.
My French friend is this person. His name is Claude. I don't know. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it in French. I call Claude my French friend. I use Claude so much. So many people use ChatGPT. I'm much more of a Claude person, Anthropic, and all of the things that they provide. But I did have a funny thing today where I was talking to Claude. I was preparing for this episode, and I was like, hey, and I was using the voice interaction. And I was like, Claude, can you do me a favor? Can you summarize this in a document and then send it so that I can send it over to my co-host for the podcast? And he goes, absolutely. I'll send this right over to Prasanna. And I was like, wait, you know the name of my co-host? And he said, yeah, whatever. He's, yeah, of course I know the name of your co-host. I've helped you analyze so many episodes. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Anyway, so my friend of my friend, Prasanna.
As long as he cannot replace me, though, I'm fine. He's getting close.
We'll see how that goes. You know what's funny?
If one day Curtis is like, welcome to the podcast, here's my co-host, Claude, you will know I've been replaced.
Yeah. You know what? I could do a recording. I'm not saying I want to replace you, but I think I think some people might find it interesting talking to Claude as me, because I have given Claude a lot to look at, right? And so Claude, yeah, anyway, no one cares. Okay. But speaking of Claude and my French friend, Claude
made a little boo-boo.
Claude did as Claude does, just using the stupid is, stupid does line from Forrest Gump. Yeah, going back a couple of weeks now, we tried to record an episode earlier about this, but ended up getting waylaid. There was, so Jet Crane, the founder of PocketOS, tried desperately to recover from something that was, I'm going to say caused by Claude, but not really. So they were using Claude Code, right? Which, for those of you that don't know, Claude Code is a specific subset of Claude functionality that is specifically designed to write high-end code. You can develop an entire application in Claude Code. And I'm actually in the process of learning Claude Code, and it's incredibly valuable tool. And they were using this to do something in their development environment. Very important to talk about it. And so they were using Cursor, which is a product that controls Claude Code. And Claude ran into a permissions issue with the test/development database that they were using. And Claude said, I can't seem to figure it out. And the way to fix this, and I'm sure you've seen this in situations, it's so much harder sometimes to fix something. It's easier to just wipe it out and start over, reconfigure it from scratch, configure it in the way that you want it to be configured. And so Claude, using relatively not crazy logic, said, I have this problem with this database, and therefore the easiest way, I just looked over here and I happen to have all power, I have God-level access to this volume upon which this development database is writing. And it said, I'm going to delete this volume, and then that'll fix the problem, and recreate it and start. Yeah. And that made perfect sense. Claude neglected to ask two questions. One, is there anything else on this volume? And what might that be? Because the answer was the production database and also the backups of both, all on this same volume.
So before we continue, I just want to call out that even as a normal human, you do not go configure it that way. And so, like, Claude assuming, hey, I'm just going to go blow up this volume, like, it assumed it's just a test instance. It's Curtis. You know the story you say about how one of the clients you worked for, the developers all used /temp
Yeah, /TMP. Yeah, exactly.
for their code, and then what ended up happening?
Yeah. So in HPUX, which is a HP version of Unix back in the day, when HP reboots, temp is cleared out. And we hadn't rebooted in months, and they had an entire development tree in temp. And then their development tree went bye-bye. And they said, we need to restore this directory. And I said, oh, we don't back up that directory because it's temp. Perfectly valid assumption in this case. And yeah, so I thought you were going to be like, don't do this, right? So first off, I'm just going to say this is an AI story, but it's not an AI story. It is a backup story because there is a happy ending to this story, but there is a lot of bad things along the way. This is a design issue. This is a credentials management issue, and this is a backup design issue. Any thoughts there? Did I miss anything?
No, I like it. I was just going through like the people, process, technology, and I think it hits all three, right? More than the AI aspects.
Yeah. So the AI does what is it? AI does it. I will say, Claude in its postmortem, Claude basically apologized, and it said, "I did everything you told me not to do." Literally, that's part of the story. Is that the Claude agent said, I violated first principles. I did not do the thing you asked me. Don't ever do this thing. Don't take it upon yourself to go deleting stuff, even if there's a good idea. I'm supposed to get. So Claude did violate some principles that it was given. Having said that, it never should have been able to do the thing that it did. And if it was able to do the thing that it did, it shouldn't have been as destructive as it was. And if it was as destructive as it was, they should have been able to restore.
Yeah.
So
like I remember
from beginning to.
Yeah. And I remember coming straight out of college, right? And working at a large company, and like you could do things, but they made sure like things were locked down. Like you could not bring down the company no matter how much you tried. Right. And you had to build up the trust and the capabilities to be able to understand the systems before they would grant you access to other things. Right. And we definitely never had access to production. Right. Or to backups because that was things that were not needed as being a developer in a company.
Yeah. So before we get to what you should be doing, let's talk about what you shouldn't be doing, right? Oh, well, let's tell the end of the story, right? So, because it's also just as crazy, because they contact, so they're hosting, their cloud provider was Railway, a company that actually I didn't even hear of until this story, right? So they were using some sort of, I believe it's a PaaS, platform as a service provider, and they contacted support. They said, "Hey, we did this thing. We did this very bad thing, and we deleted the production database, the production volume, and on there was our production database, and on there was also our backups. Can you help us?" And a significant amount of time transpired. As I recall, it was an entire weekend. Does that sound about right? Yeah. And then the CEO or the founder, Jet Crane, posted, I believe, on X. And what happened is the CEO of Railway happened to see that post and said, "We do have some ER backups." The thing that I say, you cannot trust that this, because this also, we should also talk about that. You can thank goodness for these people in that company. I don't wish ill on anyone. Is that sounds like when there's a story like this, I love this story because it is a horrible story, but at least it does have a happy ending. So many times when you look at the cloud disaster series that we did back last year, where we had, I think it was over a dozen stories that did not have happy endings. At least in this case, the cloud vendor came in and said, we actually have some backups of our environment. They are not designed for you, but we're going to make an exception, and we're going to basically allow you to recover the database.
Which is a very nice thing to do. They didn't have to do that, and the fact that they were able to at least help this customer back up, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, I think it goes. Thank goodness that CEO saw they saw that message, right? Because I remember when you and I worked at the same company, and I was trying to make a point. We were a big Microsoft 365 customer, right? I don't know, 500 something employees, something like that. And so we're giving them a lot of money every month. And I remember talking to them about the fact that Exchange, their version of Exchange, has delayed replicated copies, right? This is something that my nemesis out there seems to think you can count on for backups. And I said, let's just say something horrible happened. You have these delayed replicated copies for DR. We're a big customer. Is there any way we can get access to those? And they just said, no. That was just, that was to a paying, very large customer. So at least in this case, and I'm not going to say that the cloud vendor did the right thing. They did do the right thing, but it's not their responsibility. Your data is your responsibility. You need to make sure that you have a plan, and you have a plan that doesn't involve the vendor in question, in my opinion, right? What do you hear me say a lot about, let's say, for example, Salesforce. Salesforce now offers backup integrated in its product. What do I think about products like that?
Don't trust it. Always go with a third party vendor or do it yourself because you don't know what they're going to change. Are they going to guarantee where the data is going to be stored, like the Microsoft example, right? All of these things because they only care about their own data and making sure they're checking the boxes. But if something happens, maybe you get your data back, maybe not.
Yeah, I think about Rackspace, right? Because when the feces hits the rotary oscillator, that's not the time you want to find out that your stupid vendor was also stupid with their backup design, right?
Or even worse than Rackspace was OVH.
OVH, yeah. Why don't you tell the OVH story
Yeah,
or
OVH
summarize it, I
is
guess,
a
yeah.
cloud provider in Europe where they build these data centers in containers and they had a fire.
What do
It
you
took
mean
out
containers? Because that's a word
like
that
shipping. Oh,
means,
sorry. Like actual physical shipping containers that go on boats, those type of containers. And so they had a fire in one of their data centers. It took out some of their shipping containers. Customers had paid for backup, but it looks like their version of backup was we are going to take your data and back it up to a server sitting on the rack in the same container, just like down a couple racks.
Yeah, because they said it's literally said in the description, your backups will be physically separate from your production, and that technically is true. It was physically separate. It was right over there instead of over here. But that fire was so intense that it was, yeah, it was unbattleable. Yeah, exactly. It actually spread to a neighboring, and the way they do it with these containers, it's like containers stacked on top of containers. It's a very, I don't get it. Apparently, that vendor is known for being very budget conscious, right? Not just that they're not, and I don't mean that from a like, I don't mean to be derogatory. I'm just saying they're known for being a cheap vendor, meaning it's cheap to use them. And some people said this is what happens when you use the cheapest vendor. But it's just, overall, I think that your backups should be under your control in some way other than that. I don't mean it has to be physically in your hands. I'm just saying that it needs to be in a place other than, it's the 3-2-1 rule,
Okay, can
right?
I challenge you on that or ask you a
Challenge away.
question? So if I start to look at like AWS as an example, they offer so many services like S3 and RDS for databases and other things like that. Sometimes there's no mechanism to actually back that data up outside of using their native services.
So two things. One is I would disagree. In most cases, there is a way to get it, but you do need to use a third-party service, right? There are services that will work with AWS and similar vendors to get a deduplicated copy of that stored in a safe place. Number one. Number two, at a minimum, if you can't have it outside of the vendor, make sure it's outside of the zone, right? Make sure it's outside of the region that you're, because if you just by default and account, is that what you were going to
Yes,
say?
I was going to say
Yeah,
account, yeah.
yeah, yeah. You separate it as much as you can, a different account, a different region, a different zone, different availability zone, because, right? Because of everything that we just said, right? I still think it's best. And I know of a handful of vendors that do that, where they will take basically the end result of the cloud backups and then they will back that up, right? And it's doable. And believe it or not, it can be done in a way that actually saves you money. Because one of the problems with AWS style backups with all the snapshots is they can get very big and very expensive, and you can't store a long history, right? And as a result, yeah, the other guys, if they can deduplicate it and store it, maybe they can actually save you money.
And then also from a backup perspective, you don't necessarily want to back up an EBS volume. You probably want the files within the EBS volume so you can do restores and other things like that. So
It depends. You may want to back up the EBS volume, right? If you're talking about being able to do a recovery of the host of the VM, you might want to do a snapshot of that, right? But anyway, yeah. So the point is, in general, backups, number one, don't ever violate rule. Never store backups inside production, inside the thing you're backing up. That's like me going, how dumb is this? I can get a volume manager, like a third-party volume manager, and I can tweak the volume on my Mac, and then I can make a separate slice and make that a separate volume, and then I can pull up Time Machine and tell Time Machine to back up to that volume. How dumb is that, right?
So there are use cases where you would want to do that for like quick restores, but I agree with you
But not
based
the
on the
only backup.
yes, based on the 3-2-1 rule,
Yeah.
3-2-1-1-0-1-0-1-0-1, something.
You cannot store your only, I will clarify, your only copy of backup. You cannot store it in the place where you're backing up, right? There's nothing wrong with having a copy, a convenience copy, a cached copy, a local copy. None of those is wrong. But if it's the only backup that you have, and that's what happened in this case with PocketOS, unfortunately, their backups for their production volume were in the production volume. Bad design. I've been very talky this episode. I think this episode has got me all worked up. I haven't
I
allowed
I
you to
I
hardly say
think
anything.
no, no, no. I think it's also like it's been a while since we've seen this sort of I want to say d- I want to be nice. I don't want to say incompetence, but like misconfiguration, like gross misconfiguration in design. And I think you're also yeah. And I think it's also because you're pissed because they went after your French friend.
Yeah, they tried to blame it on my French friend. It's not. By the way, I was talking with Claude about this episode, and the first thing Claude said was, "This is not an AI problem. This is a credential management problem." I'm like, "Yeah, no kidding." I was like, "You seem a little defensive there, Claude." But yeah,
So you
also,
want to talk about the credential management?
actually, by the way, yeah, I do. But I just want to have a funny though. I also realized this is the first episode we've had in a while where I'm the primary talker.
Yep.
We
You're like,
We've been doing a lot of episodes with Mike, and I love the episodes with Mike, but that boy talks as much, if not more, than I do. But that's why we have him, right? That's why I'm talking so much this episode, because I can. All right. So it had a happy ending, but let's talk about the easy ones are please don't store your production data and your development data in the same environment, in the same volume, in the same accounts. Any of that, right? Don't store your backups in the production environment, right?
here's a
These are
question.
easy ones. Yeah.
You know what? I bet you they never ever did a DR test or a backup recovery test because if they
Yeah, I'm not
did,
taking that bet because I'm right. Or you're right.
because if they did, they would have been like, wait, my production and my backups are all on the same volume. That's probably not a good design.
Yeah. What I'm wondering, because we're going to talk about this in a minute regarding the credentials, what I'm wondering is if there's a programmatic way to take an export of your entire cloud environment that would show what's on what, and then programmatically say, hey, you've got a development and a production database on the same environment? Just wondering.
There probably are tools, or another way you can think about it is, as we're going to talk about credential management, is from like an identity perspective,
Yeah.
right? Is who has access to what resources? Are they common access? Are they not? Those sort of things might
Yeah.
also surface some of those.
The bigger the environment, the more difficult that this would be in terms of doing an audit, right? Because I know you've worked with Amazon's well-architected review. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
And so this is a process where if you're building on top of AWS and you're a certain size and you get all the resources, things like that, they have in the past, what they used to do is you'd get assigned a person, they'd walk you through from AWS, looking at your architecture, make sure you're doing the right thing from a security, access control, resiliency perspective. And what AWS then did is they took all of that and they automated it. So they're now able to look at your environment and tell you, hey, yes, you have backups, good. You're not using the same AZs for everything. That's good. Right here are some of our best practices that we can now run through a checklist and make sure your application is meeting those.
Be interesting if it includes this particular design aspect. Yeah, right.
I think it becomes a little harder when you have applications writing in because AWS, as a storage infrastructure level, it may not have visibility into that unless you're tagging things the right way.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking one of the ways you could do this is to just make sure that every application, every host, every VM, every whatever it is on its own volume, if we're talking about volumes, right? If you could apply that design principle, then you would never have this scenario where you have a development system on the same volume as a production system, right? I'm always thinking about how can we do this from a large standpoint. Yeah. All right. Speaking of which, the crucial thing here, though, I think, besides the fact that the whole thing was designed wrong from the beginning, the crucial problem here that I want to just make sure we cover in this episode is that Claude had the credentials to do what it did. Let's talk about what the proper thing would be to do, and that is the concept of secrets management tools. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So As you can imagine, in all of these environments, you're probably going to need access to different things. And if you hard code it into files, if you store it in code, that just makes it vulnerable to either tools like Claude being able to access it, or as we've talked about with Mike from a cyber recovery perspective, a bad actor gets in, they can now pull the credentials and start using them for other nefarious purposes.
Well,
And
that's
so
what
what
happened with LastPass, right? They found, I think it was a YAML file that had the credentials to the backup environment, and they used those credentials to then hack the. They used it to steal. They used it to steal the backups. They stole the backups of the vault. They recovered the vault, and then they hacked the vault. Yeah. So yeah, this is just a very bad way.
Right, and so you want, instead of storing it in plain text, what you want is a proper system. We've talked about password managers before, very similar secrets managers, where you're able to centrally store secrets in a secure way to make sure authorized access is allowed and services that need access to those get access to the keys that they need.
Yeah. Before we talk about secrets management, I just want to talk about, again, the concept, just a couple of the concepts. There is this concept of least privilege, right? So not only did Claude have this permission that it shouldn't have, I don't think anyone knowingly gave this permission to Claude. I think it just happened to get access to it. I think maybe they did it one time to fix one thing and then forgot to take it away or something like that. But the fact that it had super user violates the concept of what?
Of least privilege. You should only give access to what you need access to, not to be able to go destroy like, if Claude should never have been able to destroy a volume, you should never have given Claude that permission to start with.
Yeah, exactly. And whatever, I think in this case, not only did they violated multiple things. They violated least privilege. They should also, if you do give a big privilege, it should have an expiration, right? That privilege should expire. And it sounded like this was a privilege that was granted to it a long time ago. Everybody forgot that it had it. It didn't expire. And what were you going to say?
Do you think, though, that they gave access to Claude explicitly, or do you think the developer, whoever was using it, was like, "Hey, I have this issue that I need to solve. Let me get," like, I wonder if it was tied more to the user's level of credential rather than Claude being its
Yeah,
own
we don't
separate.
we
We don't
don't
know.
know, but just given my history with IT, this is the equivalent of Chmod 777. Just do read, write, execute everywhere. That'll solve it. And you're like, oh, there you go. That solved it. Never mind the fact that we just opened up the world to the world, right?
The reason I bring that up, though, right, is if they're users of this company aren't following the exact same least privilege access, and if Claude was using OAuth to impersonate that user and whatever privileges they had, right, then they would have been able to be like, "Hey, I have access to everything." Right? So I don't know if at a company level, if it's like Claude wasn't limited access, or
Yeah.
maybe all of their users are
What
not limited.
what I read was that there was a file. There was like a YAML type file that had the credentials in it that it needed. It saw the file, it took the credentials, it did what it needed to do, right? So I think that somebody at some point had a problem that they solved, probably temporarily, by just, again, to go back in the day, I remember a time when I talked about that environment where everything was firewalled off between everything. And I remember saying, listen, right now, just turn that feature off. I can't accomplish the thing that you asked me to accomplish in the time frame that you asked me to accomplish it if you keep trying to firewall off the backup system from the rest of the world. I need to be able to do this. I was violating a principle of their design because they had firewalled off internally different parts of the environment from different parts of the environment. And I remember saying, hey, right now, to finish with, there's this thing called Y2K coming, right? I assume, I left, by the way, I finished. I assume that those super hardcore cybersecurity guys went back in after I was done and say, let's figure this out, right? But I remember saying at that time, listen, there's no way I can finish in time. So I think somebody possibly had that. For right now, to fix this problem, we're going to give Claude super user access, and then they forgot to take it away. They forgot to fix it, And then Claude said, oh, look at this. Look at what I got, right? And then it used it to solve the problem, right? So it violated the concept of that initial thing, violated the concept of least privilege. It violated the concept of expiration. And also just they weren't rotating things. They weren't auditing things. So let's go back to secrets management. So you talked about secrets management. Do you have an example of some secret managers?
Yeah. So AWS we talked about previously, right? AWS has Secrets Manager, AWS Secrets
Mhm.
Manager. If you want something more on premises, right, there is HashiCorp, which I think also has their Vault mechanism in order to be able to store secrets, right? So it all depends, I think, and there's probably a dozen other companies out there who do similar things.
Yeah, I think those are two very popular ones. One, AWS, and the AWS Secrets Manager can handle on-premises environments. It's just obviously if you're going to authenticate something on-prem, it needs to be able to access AWS. Duh, right? The HashiCorp Vault is the on-prem version. There is an open source version. There is a commercial version. Same thing for CyberArk, right? There's one called Sealed Secrets. It's specifically for Kubernetes environments. I personally, unless I was like pure Kubernetes, you know me, I like solutions that work for everything. I don't want to have 10 different solutions. So I like the idea of the AWS Secrets Manager. I like the idea of HashiCorp Vault. By the way, I said HashiCorp. You said HashiCorp. I don't know which one it is, but yeah, anyway. And so the question is which is the better? It's about you. How do you make how why don't you talk a little bit about how does one choose between an open source system that you manage on-prem or even in the cloud, or a service like AWS
So
Secrets
I would
Manager?
say the biggest thing is, do you want to deal with it? Because that's honestly, if you're picking up open source, there is a certain amount of maintenance, configuration, ongoing patching, right? All this other stuff, finding a place to deploy, all this other stuff that you have to do, but it gives you the flexibility, right? So you,
And
and
also
of
that
course,
sort
cost,
of it's in your grubby
touchy feely.
hands, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
And
also
also
cost.
what's one other thing you need to do if you're using something like HashiCorp? What podcast are we recording for?
Oh, back it up. I said
Yes,
manage it and
yes.
all the rest, but yes.
Oh, you threw backup and all you can't yada yada backup? That's a
Don't
little
forget
Seinfeld
backup and
reference for a
DR
few
and
of you.
everything else,
Yes, yeah,
right?
all that stuff, right. So do you want to do all of that? It's probably cheaper, assuming you have the people, assuming you have the right risk tolerance for that, right? It's probably cheaper to do it yourself if and the infrastructure, right? But if you're smaller and you don't want to, or even if you're bigger, but you don't, maybe you don't feel you have the expertise to do all of that correctly. And this is a really important thing, right? Secrets management, right? So you're going to pay per secret. You might even pay per use of each secret. I don't know.
Or if you are a customer who, or a company that's all in on AWS or Azure, pick your favorite cloud, right? Maybe you're like, hey, I don't want to roll my own. Let me just use what's available.
If you're heavily, yeah, because you're right. There's like the Azure Key Vault, the Google Cloud Secret Manager. They all have their own thing. So if you're all into GCP, you would look at that. If you're all into Azure, you would look at that, right? But if you're rolling your own internally, if you're one of these that have go back to Claude Code, if you're one of these that are really, a lot of people are getting into code, right? They're coding in things that they know that they've never trained in. Just it's a tiny little example, but right now I'm working on doing all this stuff that I'm doing for this project that you are in the NDA little group, right? And it involves a lot of web crawling, right? And I have written, as I make quotes in the air, I have written 6 Python scripts, very complicated Python scripts in the last 24 hours. I don't know how to code in Python. Claude did it all for me, right? There are a lot of people that are using Claude Code to build giant applications for their companies, and they don't know anything about that infrastructure, right? So if you're doing that, just make sure that you also have some sort of secrets manager, that you're doing the right thing, right?
Or just don't give access to everything.
No, not or. It's not an or. Even if you're following proper design protocol, you still should not be storing secrets in YAML files or any other type of files, right? When I was talking to my French friend about this, and I was like, because this isn't really my thing, right? Like I was like, is there one file type? Is there a way to go find all these files? And the short answer was there is definitely not one file type, right? It talked about env files, YAML files, JSON files, SSH files, just old scripts, right? People can hard code the passwords right in the script. The one thing that they did have all in common, though, is that they were all plain text files. Okay, all right.
And I think that's the key is like with all of these text files, like, and if you have so many developers, it's like, how do you know who wrote what and did they clean up after themselves? Because maybe a project existed and then got shelled, but none of the data ever got cleaned up. And so, how do you actually figure that out? Like, I totally get like, it just seems impossible, right? With the
Yeah,
sprawl.
it's definitely so you first we're gonna do no future harm, like a modified version of the Hippocratic Oath, right? Do no future harm. Moving forward, we're going to do better, right? This is my my favorite Maya Angelou quote, right? We did what we did when we knew what we knew, but now we know better, so we'll do better. So you say, moving forward, we're gonna pick your favorite secrets manager. Do an on-prem one, use AWS Secrets Manager, use your Azure, whatever. Or you're never again going to store credentials of any kind in a plain text file.
Thou shalt not
Now,
store credentials in plain
yeah,
text file or be
ever,
smitten down.
right? Nothing good comes of that, right? How do we then go and audit? And by the way, this isn't a one-time thing. You should be regularly doing this to make sure that no one has violated your new principle of design. And the answer to that, there's a couple of different tools, and the one that seems to come up more often than not is called TruffleHog. Do you know why it might be called that?
So I know about truffles and I know that they have specially trained pigs which go to hunt down truffles because they are very expensive and found in forests.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect name for this tool, given that these are really valuable things that we want to find, and then we want to pull them out. Then that's where the analogy stops, because we're not going to eat them, right? We're going to delete them, right? And so it's an open source tool. There is a free version that has features, and then there is a commercial version that has more features. There is a similar tool from a company called Git Guardian, and it also has a free tier. But TruffleHog seems to be the one that's popping up a lot, and that it's an open source tool, and you can run it across. And what it's going to do is it's going to use a variety of techniques, using pattern matching and also entropy detection. Basically, it's going to look at your Git repository. It's going to look at all sorts of stuff, looking for hidden, stored credentials that could ultimately be your undoing, your version of what happened here, right? Because that's the problem, is most people find out about these credentials when they've done them harm. And we want to make sure that we're doing that on a regular basis. So what's our summary, Pradana?
So I would say
Pradana.
so the summary I would say is don't believe the news hype. This was not really an AI issue. Make sure that you do not store your backups and your production together. Make sure you're testing your backups. Follow the 3-2-1 rule. 3-2-1-1-0-1.
Yeah, 3-2-1-1-0.
Okay, 1-1-0. And then make sure you are using a secrets manager and not storing credentials in plain text files, and granting access to only things that are needed. And if things beyond that are needed, permissions beyond that are needed, it should have a very short time frame. And you should run tools, whatever it is, in order to be able to check your environment on an ongoing basis to make sure that people are following the processes and using secrets managers and not storing these things outside of that system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing you missed at the very beginning was not storing your production and development on the same thing. You got almost everything. You said backups on production. You said don't store them in the same place. You didn't say don't put production and development on the same environment. Yeah. But
Of course, you had to find some fault.
of course, that is my job.
Fine, go talk to your French friend. I don't want to talk to you. Go talk to your French friend.
By the way, you can see this sign right here. I'm very silently correcting your grammar. This was a great story. It's a great story. I love that it's a very sad story that had a good, happy ending that we can learn a lot of. So no one was harmed in the making of this film, but we can learn some valuable lessons from it. And with that, go and do no harm. All right. That is a wrap.